The debate is over. We've come to a conclusion. Naturalism has won. If you go to any university physics department, listen to the talks they give or the papers they write. Go to any biology department, go to any neuroscience department, any philosophy department, people whose professional job it is to explain the world, to come up with explanatory frameworks that match what we see. No one mentions God. There's never an appeal to a supernatural realm by people whose job it is to explain what happens in the world. Everyone knows that the naturalist explanations are the ones that work.
Carroll is just bloviating here.
Well, Bill, we've certainly got a lot of mileage out of your exchange with Sean Carroll at the 2014 Greer Herd Forum. And we've done numerous podcasts on the topics that came out of that debate. And, you know, it's still frequently discussed today. In fact, I've noticed that Sean Carroll's popularity seems to have grown, at least on social media. And we'll look at several of the video shorts that he has on YouTube. Various people have he's put on. You know, first, since I brought up popularity, I'm curious. I wanted to ask you, do scholars in the academy, such as yourself and Sean Carroll, often have to walk the fine line between scholarship and becoming a popularizer? Or can you do both?
Both Sean Carroll and I have tried to supplement our scholarly academic publications with popular level works. So Carroll publishes popular level books on science for the layperson. I publish popular level treatments of philosophy and theology. And so both of us are engaged in trying to produce both scholarly and popular literature. The risk in this, Kevin, is that scholars sometimes look down rather condescendingly on colleagues who do popularization. And this risk is really augmented when the only thing that these scholars know of your work is the popular level material. Then they're apt to think that this person isn't really producing substantive scholarly material. So there is a real delicate balance and risk here in trying to do both good scholarship and write for a general lay audience. But I think it's important to try to do so. And so both Sean Carroll and I are engaged in this project.
Seems to me that you can do both, but you know, other scholars it's very disparaging. They say he's a popularizer.
Yeah.
And that's not a compliment.
No. Yes, you can do both. For example, one of the great scientific popularizers was Sir Arthur Eddington, who wrote masterful books for lay people on relativity theory and cosmology and so forth. Still worth reading today. By contrast, Stephen Hawking's attempts at popularization, such as A Brief History of Time, were really huge failures. They sold very well because of his reputation, but they weren't good scientific popularization. It's hard to write popular science. Someone who's a real master at it today is David Hutchings, with whom I'm doing a book currently. Hutchings has a number of books in popular science, and he really is able to explain these difficult concepts so that the average layman can understand them.
Let's go to the first clip. Carroll is apparently responding to your work in this video short. Here it is.
When scientists talk about the Kalam argument, they really focus in on whether the universe had a beginning. And the truth is, we don't know. There's not a lot to say beyond that. We have models in which it did, models in which it didn't. We don't know what model is correct. But the other assumption of the Kalam, that if the universe had a beginning, we need God, that's just obviously wrong. That's the part where you should be focusing all of your efforts. For one thing, it's completely equivocating on the word cause, okay? It's a word that doesn't appear in fundamental physics. You can read all these papers that William Lane Craig likes to cite about quantum cosmology. The word cause is never in there. What's in there are equations that describe the laws of physics. If you were living 2,500 years ago, you might have thought that in order to explain the physical world, you need to talk about the cause of things happening. We know better now. Instead, you should be asking the question, can we come up with models in which the laws of physics explain what happened in a complete and consistent way? The answer is yes, as far as we know, and the answer is they are models that work with or without a beginning to the universe. So it's the very framework of attaching causes to beginnings that is the big mistake in the Kalam argument.
Several things there, Bill,
Yes.
including whether there is equivocation going on with the term cause.
Yes, there are several mistakes, I think, made in this clip. First of all, it is not true that there is nothing more to be said than we don't know whether the universe had a beginning. We can say, for example, that it is probable that the universe had a beginning. Even a determined critic like Lawrence Krauss admits that he thinks it is probable that the universe had a beginning. And in that case, the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is probably true, which is about all that you can ask from a good argument. Moreover, it is not obviously false that if the universe has a cause, that cause is reasonably called God. For a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe discloses that a cause of the beginning of the universe must be a first, beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe. And I think that's certainly sufficient for a concept of God. Thirdly, as for the notion of a cause, Carroll's objection is seriously misconceived. The half-truth in this objection is that causation plays no role in pure mathematics. Therefore, causation does not appear in the mathematical equations of theoretical physics. But that's only half the story. Every physical theory is composed of two components, a mathematical formalism and a physical interpretation of that formalism. And when it comes to the physical interpretation, then causation certainly can and does play a prominent role. For example, an astrophysicist will want to know what is the cause of an observed gravitational field. He wants to know what caused the craters on the surface of the moon. Indeed, he wants to know the cause of the origin of the moon itself. The moon is obviously not eternal and didn't just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. So what produced the moon? Moreover, in other fields of science, causation plays a crucial role. For example, the evolutionary biologist will want to know what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. And we're all aware of the recent controversy concerning the cause of the COVID-19 coronavirus. Where did it come from? It didn't just pop into being uncaused out of nothing. And in everyday life, causation plays a vital role. A homeowner wants to know what caused the fire that burned down my house. And not only the homeowner, but the police and insurance agents will want to know the answer to that question as well. Recently, we've asked what was the cause of the power outage in our neighborhood. There is no reason, Kevin, to restrict ourselves to the mathematical equations of theoretical physics. Moreover, the notion of causation is a philosophical notion. We're talking here about something which brings something else into existence, and that is a perfectly intelligible notion. Moreover, we do not, in fact, have any empirically adequate physical theories whose mathematical equations describe a beginningless universe, much less which describe a universe coming into being out of nothing. There is no physics of non-being that could explain the origin of the universe from nothing. So even if you confine yourself to pure mathematical equations, you will not have an explanation of the origin of the universe.
And just to be clear, really quickly, I mean, equivocation is a logical fallacy. Bill, he's accusing you of a logical fallacy when you bring up cause.
Well, that would be right. It's an informal fallacy. And I think we'll see later in our podcast today how Carroll himself equivocates on the word naturalism, where he's using it in different senses.
Let's go to the next clip. Carroll talks some more about the Kalam. Here it is.
The universe is quantum mechanical, and the fact that there's a singularity in classical general relativity in the Big Bang doesn't mean there was a beginning to the universe. It means that classical general relativity is breaking down. It's no longer applicable, and you should be quantum mechanical. We don't know enough about quantum gravity to say whether the universe had a beginning or not. We don't know whether the universe was ever contracting or not. All we can say is that our classical theories break down. And if you're honest, that's really all you can say. If you're driven for some other set of reasons to conclude that there was a beginning to the universe, you're not being honest. In these cosmologies, the universe exists at all times. There's no edge to it. There's no boundary. There's no moment when it comes into existence. There's absolutely no reason to apply the logic of we need a creator here to universes like that.
Well, again, when you're doing a video short on YouTube, you're limited to your time, but whoever put this short on limited his comments to those models that have no boundary, edge, or beginning. Is he referring to his own model, the Carroll Chin model that he developed with Jennifer Chin?
I don't think so. I think the reference to quantum mechanics suggests that he's talking about things like the Hartle-Hawking model or Alexander Vilenkin's quantum gravitational model. Now, in response to Carroll's comments here, it's true that we need to have a quantum mechanical theory of gravitation if we're to provide a description of the initial split second of the universe. But we do not need to have such a description in order to have good grounds for believing that the universe began to exist. The eminent cosmologist Charles Misner once explained it to me in this way. He said, because we don't have a quantum theory of gravitation, it is as though a tiny window shade were drawn across the first split second of the universe. And we don't know what goes on behind that shade. But, Misner said, what we do know is that the universe doesn't come out on the other side. So you can know that the universe began to exist without having a physical description of its first physical state. In quantum mechanical models, like Stephen Hawking's or Alexander Vilenkin's, they still involve a beginning of the universe. They are not past eternal. Carroll's statement that the quantum mechanical universe exists at all times is a semantic trick. What that means is that it has existed at every time that there is. But if time is finite and had a beginning, then the universe is not past eternal. It has not existed for infinite time. So even though the universe exists at all times, it is not infinite in the past, but had a beginning.
In this next clip, Carroll happens to be in discussion with Roger Penrose, and he's addressing that, the beginning and nothingness.
So if it does turn out to be true that the universe had a beginning,
You shouldn't think of it as there was nothingness and then the universe popped into existence. It's very hard to not think of that way because the flow of time is embedded in how we think about the world. And you think about, well, if there was the Big Bang, then it came from nothingness. But there wasn't a nothingness that turned into the Big Bang. That's the wrong way of thinking. Think about it from the other side. There was a first moment of time in the history of the universe. And just because there was that doesn't mean there was some reason why it happened.
So it's reasonless at the bottom.
That's right. I would sadly, I would have, Roger mentioned the disappointing idea that the universe will last for infinity years in the future and we'll all be dead. It's also kind of disappointing to say, well, why did the universe exist at all? And the answer is it just did. Stop asking questions like that.
Yeah, that is disappointing. There are multiple things in that short clip to cover, Bill, so take your pick.
Well,
Carroll,
the thing that just jumps out at me, Kevin, and I hope it did it to you as well, he says, stop asking questions like that. How astonishing it is that Carroll would seek to squelch one of the most profound questions that a person can ask, a question about the origin of the universe. Now, Carroll is absolutely correct that you should not think of the beginning of the universe as first a state of nothingness, and then the universe came into existence out of that state of nothingness. This is a point that I have made repeatedly in my work. Rather, you should think of it as the first moment of time before which there was not anything. And the question is then, why did the universe begin to exist?
you said to think of it instead as the first moment of time in the history of the universe.
Right.
He also mentions the flow of time and that the universe just is. And again, is he just said it's a brute fact? You come to it right there.
Yes, for him, you stop asking questions like that. It's just a brute fact. You shouldn't even ask it. It's astonishing to me that he should think that. It may be the case, Kevin, that Carroll does not accept a dynamic or tensed theory of time, according to which things come into being and go out of being. He probably is articulating a tenseless or static theory of time, according to which the difference between past, present, and future is just a human illusion, and everything just exists at its spatiotemporal coordinates. And so on that view, he would say there is no basis for asking about why the universe began to exist. In that case, it seems to me, the appropriate question would be Leibniz's question. Well, then why is there something rather than nothing? And that is a profound metaphysical question given the contingency of the universe.
Let's get into some excerpts from Carroll's opening statement in a debate that he had at Caltech entitled, "Has Science Refuted Religion?" Carroll argues for naturalism. Here's the first clip.
Religion and science have gone their separate ways over the years. 500 years ago, this debate would not have been held. There was no demarcation between what we would now call science and what we would call religion. There was just attempts to understand the world. And what happened is that science came about by developing techniques, methodologies for gaining reliable knowledge about the world. And the reliable knowledge that we got was incompatible with some of the presuppositions of religious belief. The basic thing that we learned by doing science for 400 years is something called naturalism. The idea that there is only one reality, that there are not separate planes of the natural and the supernatural, that there is only one material existence, and we are part of the universe. We do not stand outside of it in any way.
So he says the scientific method was developed to provide reliable knowledge about the world, and this naturally led to naturalism. Bill, no pun intended.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's important to understand that what Carroll is plumping for here is not methodological naturalism. That is to say, the assumption by the investigative scientist that he is looking only for natural causes of the data. Rather, Carroll is plumping for metaphysical naturalism, which is a philosophical position that is not justified scientifically. Science does not teach the metaphysical worldview of naturalism, which is the view that all that exists is space-time and its contents. There's nothing scientifically that proves that that sort of metaphysical naturalism is true. Now, what is correct is that science has developed techniques to help give us reliable knowledge about the physical world. That is one of the triumphs of science. But that concerns the limited domain of science. And there is no reason to think that those techniques are relevant to other fields of inquiry, such as, for example, ethics or metaphysics or even literary criticism. So Carroll here is assuming some sort of scientistic epistemology, as well as begging the question in favor of metaphysical naturalism.
Let's look at some more of those techniques. Here's more from Carroll on the techniques developed by science.
And the way that science got there is through basically realizing that human beings are not that smart. You are not Vulcans, you're not Mr. Spock, you're not perfectly logical. We as human beings are subject to all sorts of biases and cognitive shortcomings. We tend to be wishful thinkers and to see patterns where they're not there and so forth. And in response to this, science developed techniques for giving ourselves reality checks, for not letting us believe things that the evidence does not stand up to. One technique is simply skepticism, which you may have heard of. Scientists are taught that we should be our own theory's harshest critics. Scientists spend all their time trying to disprove their favorite ideas. This is a remarkable way of doing things that is a little bit counterintuitive, but helps us resist the lure of wishful thinking.
You know, Bill, I'm sure he didn't have time in an opening statement in a debate to discuss the various kinds of skepticism. There's iterative skepticism, global skepticism, local skepticism, and whether one should be skeptical about everything but his own skepticism, things like that. You know, I'm not trying to be uncharitable. Can he be referring to a general skepticism as a valid technique?
Well, it seems to me, Kevin, that Carroll is not really talking here about philosophical skepticism, which, as you intimate, is self-defeating. The skeptic claims not to be able to know anything, and then you wonder, well, how do you know that? So I think Carroll is simply talking about being self-critical. He says scientists are their own toughest critics. And one can corroborate one's scientific theory by articulating ways in which it could be falsified. And then you perform experiments to see if the theory survives such attempts at falsification. And if it does, then the theory is said to be corroborated. So surviving these attempts at falsification is actually one technique for proving the truth of a scientific theory. Now, philosophers do exactly the same thing with the theories that they offer. They always consider the very best objections to the positions that they proposed. I've often thought, Kevin, that if you want to read really tough critiques of the arguments for the existence of God, then don't read what the atheists are writing, which are typically very shallow and poorly thought through. Rather, you should read the work of other Christian philosophers who are the severest critics of certain theistic arguments. So what Carroll is talking about as a scientific technique is one that is analogously applied in doing philosophical work as well.
And he has some more techniques. Carroll offers a second technique in this next clip.
The other technique is empiricism. We realize that we are not smart enough to get true knowledge about the world just by thinking about it. We have to go out there and look at the world. And what we've done by this for the last 400 years is to realize that human beings are not separate, that the world is one thing, the natural world, and it can be understood. This is very counterintuitive. This is not at all obvious, this naturalism claim.
You can't just think, you also have to look, Bill. Empiricism, is this the empirical verificationist principle that you've talked about, or perhaps a weaker version of it?
No, I don't think so, Kevin. Carroll is not claiming that if something is not in principle empirically verifiable, then it is meaningless. He's merely claiming that in order to do good science, you cannot simply speculate, but you have to experiment and observe. Where he errs, I think, is in thinking that such observation and experiment somehow demonstrate the truth of materialism. And not only are there no good arguments for the truth of materialism, but as I explain in volume 2A of my systematic philosophical theology and the discussion of divine incorporeality, Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism is a crushing defeater of materialism or physicalism. So interested readers can take a look at that discussion in volume 2A under incorporeality.
And I'll just say to my fellow lay apologists, you have to be careful. Don't jump to a conclusion. If you hear empiricism, take a second look. Don't immediately say, he's talking about the empirical verificationist principle, and that's been refuted. You know, you can't even empirically verify the empirical verificationist principle, things like that. But that wasn't what he was talking about there. So I'm just saying, drop back, make sure that you're not triggered by a certain phrase. You know, mind-body dualism comes up next, and here's the clip.
When you talk to a person, they have thoughts and feelings and responses. When you talk to a dead person, a corpse, I hate to be morbid here, but you don't get those same responses, those same thoughts and feelings. It's very natural, very commonsensical to think that a living person possesses something that a corpse does not. Some sort of spirit, some sort of animating soul or life force. But this idea, as it turns out, does not stand up to closer scrutiny. And a big step towards realizing this was made back in the 1600s by a remarkable woman named Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. They made princesses differently back in the 17th century. Elizabeth carried on a years-long correspondence with René Descartes, who famously tried to develop a theory of mind-body dualism. And Elizabeth said, I don't understand what you're saying, because if you really believe that the mind is in a separate realm from the body, my mind makes a choice to lift my arm, but it's my body that does it. How does the immaterial mind that you say doesn't exist at a location in space, how does it act causally on the body? How does it interact with the stuff out of which you are made? And Descartes never came up with a reliable, believable response to this objection. Of course, these days, the objection is enormously stronger. You would say, you are made of atoms. You are made of cells, which are made of molecules, which are made of atoms. And as physicists, we know how atoms behave. The laws of physics governing the behavior of atoms are completely understood. You put an atom in a certain set of circumstances, if you tell me what those circumstances are, as a physicist, I will tell you what the atom will do. If you believe that the atoms that are inside your brain and your body act differently because they are in a living person than if they are in a rock or a crystal, then what you're saying is that the laws of physics are wrong, that they need to be altered because of the influence of a spirit or a soul or something like that. That may be true. Science can't disprove that, but there is no evidence for it. And you get a much stronger explanatory framework by assuming that it's just atoms obeying the laws of physics. That kind of reasoning is a big step toward naturalism.
Yeah, that's interesting about Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia and Descartes, Bill. But Carroll thinks we can pretty much rule out mind-body dualism, even if we can't totally disprove it.
I think that he's mistaken here. What's the objection to dualist interactionism supposed to be here? He seems to think that the problem is that the soul is not located in its body and therefore cannot affect it. But in fact, Descartes did believe that the soul is spatially located in its body. And so the objection would not apply to Descartes. And for those of our listeners who are interested in learning more about mind-body dualism and philosophy of mind, I want to recommend highly this little book by Stuart Getz and Charles Tolliver called A Brief History of the Soul. And this book will describe the views of people like Plato, Descartes, Locke, and others, as well as survey the principal objections to mind-body dualism. So Tolliver and Getz's little book, A Brief History of the Soul, is accessible to the layperson, a really good book that I can recommend. Now, in terms of what Carroll says, it's question-begging to assert you are made of atoms, as he did. Just ask yourself, what is referred to here by the pronoun you? Carroll just assumes that it's your physical body, which begs the question that you are your physical body. But while it is true that your body is made of atoms, that in no way demonstrates that you, the person, are made of atoms. So it's simply question begging. Moreover, it's completely wrong to say that scientists can predict on the basis of atomic matter what you will think or feel or do. Everything is not determined by the laws of physics. An excellent book on this was written several years ago by Sir John Eccles, who holds a Nobel Prize in neurology, and Sir Karl Popper, one of the most eminent philosophers of science. They wrote a book called The Self and Its Brain. And you notice in the title, the self or person is distinguished from the brain, the physical organ that sits, or material that sits in your skull. And the view of dualism interactionism is that while the mind and the brain are distinct, the mind uses the brain as an instrument for thought. Eccles once put it to me in the following way. He said the relationship between the mind and the brain is like the relationship between a pianist and the piano. The pianist uses his piano as an instrument to make music. Now, if the piano is damaged in any way, then the pianist will be unable to produce the beautiful music. And in exactly the same way, the self uses the brain as an instrument for thought. And if the brain is damaged, for example, through drugs or cancer or Alzheimer's disease, then the self will be impaired in its ability to use the brain as an instrument for thought. So the brain and the self are not the same thing, but they work together to produce mental states of awareness, self-consciousness, and intentionality. The evidence for the reality of the mind is not physical evidence. Rather, it is what is called phenomenology, our inner experience of mental awareness, intentionality, self-conscious states, mental causation, a first-person perspective. And the naturalist or physicalist or materialist is wholly unable to give an adequate account of these phenomenal mental states. They, I think, are plausibly explained by positing the existence of a mind or self.
And next up, the unmoved mover.
Another big step also happened in the 1600s when Galileo came upon the idea of conservation of momentum. And you might say, why does conservation of momentum get in the way of my belief in the existence of God? But it does. Because before Galileo came along, physics was described by Aristotle. And Aristotle said something very obvious and commonsensical, that if you want something to keep moving, you need to push it. Things naturally come to rest, left to their own devices. But if you look at the world, you realize that things are moving all over the place. So Aristotle very logically eventually concluded that you need to invoke the existence of an unmoved mover, which can be identified, of course, with God. But then, of course, Galileo comes along and says, actually, the natural behavior of matter is to keep moving at a constant velocity. Motion is perfectly natural. When things stop, it's because you are acting on them through friction or air resistance or dissipation. And then Isaac Newton comes along and builds an elaborate edifice of mechanics, which explains the world beautifully in purely material principles. And it's very, very interesting. Once that happened, you realize that the prime mover argument doesn't work as well, and you can actually see a change in the theological literature of the time.
Yeah, I need a lot of help in the area of unmoved mover, Bill. There's some more reading I need to do. I realize that I always think about the unmoved mover in terms of when something began to move. But there's also the question of why things are moving, maybe a sustaining force and things like that. And Carroll brings up that matter, when left to itself, tends to keep moving. Galileo said that. Talk to us about all the physics and theological implications he's bringing up.
Well, this clip really brings back memories for me. I discussed the argument for the unmoved mover in my very first book, The Cosmological Argument from Plato to Leibniz. And Kevin, if you want to learn about the unmoved mover, I'd refer you to that book, which includes a chapter on both Aristotle and on Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas enunciated 5 ways of proving the existence of God. And the first of these was an argument from motion. This argument relied upon Aristotelian physics, which had no concept of inertia. So Thomas thought that anything that is moving needs to have a cause of its motion. The argument wasn't about beginning to move. It was simply about things in motion. The replacement of Aristotelian physics by Newtonian physics undermined the argument from motion, because any object in motion will continue in motion in a straight line and with a constant velocity unless acted upon by some external force. So the argument for the unmoved mover that Thomas articulated was undermined by the transition from Aristotelian to Newtonian physics. But this concept of inertial motion had absolutely no effect upon Thomas's other arguments, such as the argument from contingency, the design argument, and the moral argument. Neither does it have any effect upon the Kalam cosmological argument, which deals with the fact that the universe began to exist.
Well, let's look at some more of this opening statement from Sean Carroll. Here's the next clip, the argument from design.
Before Newton and Galileo, there was emphasis put on ideas of prime movers and first causes, arguments from cosmology and contingency and so forth. After Newton and Galileo, the argument emphasized something else, the argument from design. People would say, well, sure, you can explain the planets moving, that's easy, but all of the life forms, the marvelous diversity of life here on Earth, that had to be made by some guiding external intelligence. In fact, in the 1700s, Immanuel Kant said, there will never be an Isaac Newton for a blade of grass. Then, of course, in the 1800s, we got an Isaac Newton for a blade of grass. His name was Charles Darwin. Darwin showed how material, matter all by itself, without guidance, without purpose, without an aim, just by the natural motion of ordinary things, can lead to the marvelous diversity of organic life that we see here on Earth. That was another huge step in the direction of naturalism.
So Darwin filled in a big step on the stairway to naturalism, Bill?
Well, without in any way wanting to trash Darwin, I have to say, in all honesty, that Professor Carroll greatly exaggerates the significance of Darwin's accomplishment. People need to understand, I think, that the theory of evolution itself has evolved. If we ignore theories of evolution prior to Darwin, what Darwin's theory postulated was two theses. First was the descent of all living organisms from a handful of common ancestors. And second, the natural selection of variable traits as the explanation for the adaptedness of organisms to their environment. Now, the first thesis, the thesis of common descent, was almost immediately very widely accepted in the scientific community. But for 70 years after Darwin, the scientific community remained acutely skeptical of the adequacy of Darwin's theory because natural selection could not explain the origin of biological complexity. In a nutshell, Darwin's theory could explain the survival of the fittest. Natural selection will weed out maladaptations, but it said nothing to explain the arrival of the fittest. What was the source of the variable traits that organisms exhibit that natural selection then acts upon? This question was entirely unanswered in Darwin's theory. Now, this deficit of Darwin's original theory was largely remedied by the eventual marriage in the 1930s and 40s of Darwin's theory with the genetics of Gregor Mendel, of which Darwin was completely ignorant. This has come to be known as the modern synthesis. In the modern synthesis, variability could be explained through random genetic mutations that natural selection could then act upon to weed out the deleterious mutations. And this is the theory as most of us learned it in high school. But by the late 1980s, the inadequacies of the modern synthesis became apparent to evolutionary biologists. The theory did not, in fact, provide a causal account of the development of biologically complex structures. And several other tenets of the modern synthesis were also called into question. So the modern synthesis has now been superseded by the so-called extended evolutionary synthesis, which seeks to augment the explanatory mechanisms of the modern synthesis in an effort to make the theory more explanatorily adequate. But, in fact, there is no consensus among evolutionary biologists concerning what shape the extended evolutionary synthesis should take. An adequate explanation of biological complexity still remains a pipe dream. And when the next anniversary, 50 years from now, of Darwin's book will be celebrated, evolutionary biologists say we have no idea of how different that theory is going to look from the modern synthesis. In any case, the contemporary articulations of the argument from design, as I'm sure you're aware, Kevin, don't appeal to biological complexity, but rather to the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe that make the origin and evolution of life possible in the first place. Scientists have been stunned by the discovery of how delicate and complex a balance of initial conditions of constants and quantities must be given in the very beginning of the universe in order for the universe to permit the evolution of embodied conscious agents like ourselves. And therefore, the argument design remains today very robust and very much a subject of discussion, both by philosophers and evolutionary biologists.
Two more clips to look at from Sean Carroll in this one. Carroll declares the current state of naturalism.
Now, of course, I could go on. We could talk about modern cosmology and the origin of the universe. We could talk about neuroscience and what consciousness is and so forth. But I don't want to do that right now. We can maybe talk about it later. But I don't want to do it right now basically because it's kind of boring. And the reason why it's kind of boring is because the argument is finished. The debate is over. We've come to a conclusion. Naturalism has won. If you go to any university physics department, listen to the talks they give or the papers they write. Go to any biology department, go to any neuroscience department, any philosophy department, people whose professional job it is to explain the world, to come up with explanatory frameworks that match what we see. No one mentions God. There's never an appeal to a supernatural realm by people whose job it is to explain what happens in the world. Everyone knows that the naturalist explanations are the ones that work.
Well, he didn't say naturalism is currently winning. He said naturalism has won, and the debate is over, Bill. It's ironic to me that the things he calls boring are among the very things that are calling naturalism and materialism into question, like cosmology, the origin of the universe, the hard problem of consciousness, things like that. If naturalism has won, in what way has it won, Bill?
Carroll is just bloviating here, Kevin. Remember earlier in our podcast, I said that he commits the fallacy of equivocation with respect to the word naturalism. The task of natural science is to provide natural explanations of phenomena in the world. So scientists are by and large committed to methodological naturalism. They look for and only consider natural causes. But that does absolutely nothing to establish the truth of metaphysical naturalism, the philosophical claim that the physical world is all there is. So Carroll's claim is simply based on an equivocal confusion of methodological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism.
One more clip. Carroll says, even though naturalism has won the day, we're still having this debate.
And yet, here we are. We're having a debate. Why are we having a debate? Because clearly, religion speaks to people for reasons other than explaining what happens in the world. Most people who turn to religious belief do not do so because they think it provides the best theory of cosmology or biology. They turn to religious belief because it provides them with purpose and meaning in their lives, with a sense of right and wrong, with a community, with hope. So if we want to say that science has refuted religion, we need to say that science has something to say about those issues. And on that, I have good news and bad news for you. The bad news is that the universe does not care about you. Qua universe. Don't take up my time. I'm in a hurry here. The universe is made of elementary particles that don't have intelligence, don't pass judgment, do not have a sense of right and wrong. And the fear is, the existential anxiety is that if that purpose and meaningfulness is not given to me by the universe, then it cannot exist. The good news is that that fear is a mistake, that there's another option, that we create purpose and meaning in the world. If you love somebody, it is not because that love is put into you by something outside, it's because you created that from inside yourself. If you act good to somebody, it's not because you're given instructions to do so, it's because that's a choice that you made. This is a very scary world. You should be affected at a very deep level by the thought that the universe doesn't care, does not pass judgment on you. But it's also challenging and liberating that we can create lives that are worth living. I've never met God. I've never met any spirits or any angels, but I've met human beings. Many of them are amazing people. And I truly believe that if we accept the universe for what it is, if we approach reality with an open mind and an open heart, then we can create lives very much worth living. Thank you.
Okay, meaning and purpose, Bill. It caught my ear at the end when he said to approach these things with an open mind and an open heart. And I'm sure he's just using heart in the current vernacular, but I think it's rather telling. He acknowledges something of a duality that mind and heart should work together.
Well, I think Carroll is absolutely correct that religion speaks to people for reasons other than explaining what happens in the physical world. I myself have insisted on that point. Moreover, I agree that the physical universe does not care about you. And I've argued that if God does not exist, it then follows that there is no objective meaning, value, or purpose in life. And so Carroll and I are complete agreement on that. Now, Carroll's alternative is to say that we create meaning and value and purpose in life. Now, this is just to say that those things are person relative and therefore wholly subjective and arbitrary. The values that you choose are no better than the values of the fascist or the racist. The person who dedicates his life to the purpose of humanitarianism is no more correct than the person who gives his life to the exploitation of young girls on a pleasure island. Carroll speaks of lives worth living, but on his view, there is no objective standard that determines what is a life worth living.